It's been primarily Council of Michigan Foundations and Michigan Nonprofit Association. Um, since I went to work at the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, I've been very active with CMF, attended all of the annual meetings. When I got to McGregor, I was elected to the board of CMF, served on the board for 9 years, chaired it for 2 years. It feels like I've served on just about every committee that CMF has. With M&A, I watched the creation of it, and I've been a member, I've been involved with organizations that have been members all along, and certainly we've supported the work of M&A, and really felt that it was a very important partner organization to CMF. Likewise, with the Johnson Center, I watched the creation of that. We had an opportunity to provide startup funding for it. And I've been involved in projects where the Johnson Center has been an important partner, most recently with the Learn Philanthropy effort on grantmaker education. Miles has been an important part of the planning of that. And it's been exciting to watch the Johnson Center become a really widely, nationally recognized center for philanthropy and grantmaker education and all of that work. Yes, it was 1986 that I went to work for the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. I thought about that question, and there were two people that came to mind who I think have really stood out in terms of philanthropic leadership in Michigan in the last probably 50 years. One would be Dottie Johnson, and the other would be Russ Mawbey. And as I think about what Dottie and Russ have accomplished, sometimes in partnership and lots of things on their own, they have really dared to dream things and implement things that have never been tried anywhere else in the country. And so it's been exciting to watch as Michigan becomes the role model for so much of the rest of the country in terms of things like the Community Foundation initiative, that the Community Foundation Youth Initiative that Kellogg sponsored, and the work that they did to make sure that every geographic region of the state was served by a community foundation. Dottie's work in making sure that CMF was able to help implement those kinds of initiatives. Both of them looked at the state and thought about what can we do philanthropically to make Michigan a better place to live for everyone, all the citizens of Michigan. And they've accomplished so much. And both, different personalities, but both very strong, very important leaders. Well, I'll start with Russ. Russ headed the Kellogg Foundation for, I think it was 20 years, maybe more. And the Kellogg Foundation is a very large organization, lots of people that work there. And yet the work that was done over those years, you could sort of see Russ's imprint on all of it. And he clearly was a very effective leader of that organization. And I think he mentored and helped create really strong leaders. You look at the people who came through the Kellogg Foundation and have gone on to other work, including someone like Dave Egner at the Hudson Weber Foundation and leading the New Economy Initiative. There were lots of leaders developed, and I think it was very much the style, the leadership style of Russ to mentor other people coming through the organization. And so while things like the Community Foundation Youth Program was led by Joel Arose and led very effectively, Russ was clearly back there helping with the ideas and helping Joel with the development of that. And so again, a real strong mentoring style. Dottie, Dottie is a force of nature. There's just no stopping Dottie. And I think it was by sheer force of will. Dottie created the Council of Michigan Foundations with other philanthropic leaders in the state, but I can't imagine it having developed and become the largest regional association of grant makers in the country without Dottie's leadership in those early years, getting it started, and drawing particularly family philanthropy. So many of the family foundations in Michigan are members of CMF, and I think that's largely Dottie's influence on them. And certainly there's been great leadership of the Kellogg Foundation since Russ stepped down. There's been great leadership by Rob of CMF since Dottie stepped down, but I think those two individuals really started those organizations on a path to provide great leadership. I think the place where I have best had an opportunity to see it was serving on the board of the Forum of Regional Associations, and Michigan is viewed differently. And people still remember Dottie Johnson and the brilliant things that she put in place in Michigan. There are so many regional associations around the country that have, maybe 100 members. They've just never been able to build the sort of momentum that Michigan has. It's really interesting question, and I did come out of higher education, and while there was a sense of collegiality among higher education institutions, there was at root a sense of competition for students, for good ideas, for faculty members. And when I came into the field of philanthropy, I was amazed at how foundations were willing to collaborate. And foundations have very different missions from each other. They have different leadership styles, and yet in Michigan, there has always been a willingness to work together to collaborate. And I think it's largely been the type of leadership that we've had in Michigan. And so you take Randy Rieker and Herb Dow at the Dow Foundation. They were so active in CMF. Herb had chaired the CMF board. Randy has chaired the CMF board. People like Russ at Kellogg, people like Bill White at Mott, Ted Taylor and John Marshall at the Kresge Foundation. Those were the people who were there when I came into the field. And there was so much emphasis on, and what are you doing at your foundation? And are there some ways that we could work together? And of course, CMF provided the glue that helped make that collaboration even more effective, because CMF was able to provide a forum to bring people together and staff to help make the collaboration work. Well, I'm trying to think of examples of disagreement while I was on the CMF board, and I can't think of that many, and I think it's largely because of the credibility of CMF and the respect that the members have for the work that CMF does. And so when people are at the table, board members are at the table of CMF, I think they are thinking beyond their own foundation's interests and thinking of the good of the state and the good of the philanthropic sector in the state. And so I really can't think of that kind of disagreement. First Dottie and then Rob were such effective leaders of the organization and so effective at thinking about the broader philanthropic perspective for the state that I think people were largely able to leave their personal interests behind. Part of what I always enjoyed about my work with CMF, as well as my work as a board member of the Council on Foundations, was the contact with colleagues, the opportunity to get to know people beyond my immediate community. And so at the McGregor Fund, we work closely with other foundations in the Detroit area. But CMF gave me an opportunity to get to know people in northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, the west side of the state. And that was thrilling to me. And not only to get to know them personally, but also to learn about how their foundations work. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are so many different approaches that foundations take to the work. And then likewise, on the Council on Foundations board, the opportunity to get to know people from around the country and see their work around the country. It's been a lot of fun. Where the conflict would sometimes come in would be, for instance, Dave Egner and I talked with incoming Governor Granholm and suggested that there be an Office of Foundation Liaison. And she said, well, that sounds like a great idea. What do we need to do to make that happen? And Dave and I said, well, we think the foundations might be willing to put up the money to do that. And so when I go to the Board of Trustees at the McGregor Fund and say, this is a great idea, we really ought to support this because other foundations in Michigan are going to support it, I also have to very carefully disclose to the board that, well, I was one of the people that thought of it and suggested that we could do this. And to the credit of the board of the McGregor Fund and when I was on the staff at the Community Foundation before, those boards have recognized the important role that a group like CMF plays and the importance of supporting the work that they're doing, including both as a member foundation, but also providing philanthropic resources to do the special projects that are being done. The Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan serves such a broad region. It's 7 counties, 7 of the most populous counties in the state. And so we thought about how can we put together an advisory committee that will represent, to the greatest extent possible, this region. And so we invited several of the youth-serving agencies in the region for the CEO of those agencies to become a part of the advisory committee. And then we asked each of those CEOs to identify a young person that their agency was involving in different kinds of programs to be their partner on the advisory committee. So it was half adults, half young people. And it was a fabulous group of young people. And some of them were also from pretty poor neighborhoods. There was a young woman on the initial advisory committee who lived with her grandmother on the east side of Detroit. The parents were not in the picture. And the first year of the youth retreat, she went along with another young lady, also from Detroit. And on the drive up, the one young woman said, they mentioned that there was going to be swimming available, and I don't have a swimsuit. And so we actually stopped on the trip up. I can't remember where the retreat was, but we stopped on the way up and bought her a swimsuit so that she would be able to swim with the other young people at the retreat. And one of our meetings of the advisory committee, I'll come back to the retreat in a second, but one of the meetings of our advisory committee was held out at Cranbrook at the schools. And Cranbrook has a program called Horizons Upward Bound that takes bright, talented kids from inner city Detroit, brings them, enrolls them as a student in the Cranbrook schools. And for lots of the young people that have this opportunity, that opens lots of doors for them. And so we were having one of our youth advisory committee meetings out at Cranbrook, and this young woman, Ebony, mentioned that this was a beautiful setting, and wow, would she really like to go to school out there. and the director of the Horizons Upward Bound program was on the committee. He was the host for this meeting, and he said, well, why don't you apply for the Horizons Upward Bound program? And he was able to get her into the program. And the last I heard, Ebony had graduated from Wayne State Medical School and is now working as a doctor. And that is an example of someone, I'm not sure she would have ever made those connections to have those kinds of opportunities if it hadn't been for serving on that youth advisory committee and attending that meeting out at Cranbrook. But the other story I was going to tell from the youth retreat, I don't know, maybe you remember the name of the camp, but we were Spring Hill, yes. And so we were assigned to boxcars or cabooses, train cars, to sleep. And so I go to my assigned train car off in the woods, and I swear it was a 1.5 mile walk from where the dining hall and the meetings were. And I get there, and there are these bunks set up, and I quickly realize that I am the only adult in a train car with about 12.5 middle school and high school students. And it was sort of like being back at summer camp. The kids, who were all just getting to know each other, were talking until about 3 in. And I remember the walk to the dining hall for breakfast the next morning being a really long walk. I felt like I'd had about 2 hours of sleep all night. But it wound up being such a successful retreat and an opportunity for these young people from rural Michigan, from inner city Detroit, and every place in between to come together and talk about the things that were on their minds and the things that young people are dealing with in their communities. I think they were intrigued by the idea. You know, this was a group of board members who are philanthropists in their own right, and I'm sure they initially thought, $1 million for young people to give away? What do they know about philanthropy? And of course, you give young people the opportunity to learn about this and to talk about the issues that they see. They're just as aware, if not more so, of what's going on in the community than these philanthropic older adult board members. And so over time, as the board had a chance to hear about what the young people were doing, they really believed it was a great idea. What I've learned about leadership is there are different styles. There are really obvious styles of leadership, very visible. You recognize that you're being led, and then there are other quieter, more subtle forms of leadership. But regardless of what form it takes, leaders are thinking about how can the world be made a better place, and how can we work together in creating that. And certainly that's the case with philanthropic leadership. And so it's about sharing that vision and helping others to see that, and understanding the visions that others have, and then being able to organize the resources to make that happen. And I've been so fortunate in my life and my career to see so many different types of leadership, but all moving toward making Michigan, Detroit, the US, better places for people to live. You know, all the money in the world isn't going to make a difference unless you've got people who are highly motivated and have good ideas. And I think what's been important in Michigan is there have always been people who are highly motivated, and there have been people who are talking to each other with good ideas. And Michigan is fortunate to have philanthropic resources to be able to get behind those. But it's been the good ideas and the capable people that have made the difference. And frankly, that's what I've enjoyed so much about my work first with the Community Foundation and then the McGregor Fund, I get to listen to people who have great ideas. And what better way to do one's work than hearing from really bright, highly motivated people. And all they need is a little bit of funding to be able to move those forward and to be in that really special position of being able to leverage those ideas by providing a little bit of money behind them. It's been such great work. Michigan, philanthropic leaders in Michigan have always been willing to take big chances. That's not to say that they're crazy chances. They are pretty carefully thought through. I think another thing that has really made a difference is that in Michigan, as we have started down the path of a venture, if we find ways to improve it, people have never been afraid to step back and say, oh, you know what, let's go this way. We think we can be more effective this way. And as an example, that's really been the case with the New Economy Initiative. It started out funding lots of different ideas in Michigan and then really zeroed in on the innovation and entrepreneurism work of a few key organizations going on in Southeast Michigan, and has gone into that area in a way that is really going to make a long-term difference for the economy of Michigan. I think Dottie Johnson was the first regional association director in the country to start taking her members to Washington to meet with elected officials from Michigan and to tell them about the philanthropic work that's going on in the state. And of course, now regional associations from all over the country are doing that. And yet every year, Michigan has more of its members on the ground on that day in Washington than any of the other states. And Michigan has always been looked to as the leader in that. And the other regional associations still talk about Dottie and the idea that she started and how Rob is able to marshal members to go to Washington and make those calls. And you know, Congress has become so divided, so partisan, and yet CMF members who in their private lives would be Republicans and Democrats still go together and call on those elected officials. And our point of reference is what's going on philanthropically in their district. What are the programs going on with young people? What are the programs going on with veterans, with seniors? And more than any of the other regions in the country, when we call on our elected officials, they want to meet directly with us. For other regions, they wind up meeting with staffers. But for CMF, it's usually those Congress people themselves that we get to sit down and brief on those things. Well, the one that stands out every year is when we go see Senator Carl Levin. Rob always arranges that one for the last visit of the day. You know, during the day, we're divided into 2 or 3 different groups so we could hold simultaneous meetings, but we all come together to meet with Senator Levin. And one year, it was late in the afternoon on the day that the State of the Union address was going to be, and he took us to his private office over in the Capitol. And so we had a chance to go through lots of security to get into the Capitol literally 3 hours before the State of the Union address was going to take place. And Senator Levin is always so hospitable with us. And he loved Dottie and he loves Rob, and he holds that kind of regard for CMF and the foundation members that he'll often take a full hour to meet with us. There have been times that he's had to excuse himself to go participate in a floor vote, and then he comes back and picks up where he'd left off. You'll probably also be talking with Dave Egner?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I'm sure Dave will tell the story the same way, but the Citizens Research Council was holding a reception in their new offices over in Novi, and they had invited Governor-elect Jennifer Granholm to come to the reception. And so Dave had been in the same leadership Detroit class with Jennifer Granholm. And so Dave and I find ourselves talking with the governor-elect sort of off in a corner during this reception. And we were telling her about how, while Dennis Archer was mayor of Detroit, the foundations had helped the mayor create an Office of Foundation Liaison in the mayor's office, and how helpful that had been for providing a forum for foundations and city government to sit down and talk to each other and look for areas where we could work together. So, and also to make sure that we weren't working at cross purposes, which could sometimes be the case. And Governor-elect Granholm said, "Wow, that sounds like a great idea. I'd love to do something like that, but how do we pay for it?" And I said, "Well, you know, in the case of Mayor Archer's office, the foundation's paid for it, and I'll bet we could arrange something like that here." And she said, "Well, that's great. Let's make that happen." So Dave and I looked at each other and said, "Okay, we need to call Rob Collier tomorrow morning." And so we called Rob, and Rob liked the idea. He thought it was great. And so we started having conversations with other foundation leaders who also liked the idea. And we were able to raise the money to get it started. And Karen Aldridge-Eason in that role has been so helpful in creating opportunities for discussion with first Governor Granholm and now Governor Snyder, with department heads, to make sure that philanthropy knows what the state is doing and the state leaders know what philanthropy is doing. And we find so often that we're pursuing the same things, and we're able to say, let's marshal our resources together, and let's focus on this together. And so things from job training, veterans affairs, all kinds of things. Karen has been right at the middle of creating opportunities for philanthropy in the state to work together.
Your sense is that it's a really successful model that someone might want to take a look at.
Yes, yeah. And other groups around the country have been contacting Karen for the last several years, saying, "How did you do this? And how did you pay for this? And wow, you really sit down and spend time talking with the governor about what philanthropy is doing." And yeah, it's been a model that others have shown a lot of interest in. One that comes to mind would be the first CMF conference that I ever went to. Again, I had come out of working in higher education, and you know, the speakers were terrific. It was an amazing room full of people, hundreds and hundreds of people at the conference. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I'm not in higher education anymore. This is a different world. And the quality of conferences has always been superb. And I often found when I would go to the national conferences, the Council on Foundations, COF would be hosting a speaker that I had heard a year or two before at CMF. CMF was really bringing in world-class speakers. I remember Bishop Desmond Tutu as a speaker. We've had celebrities that are involved in philanthropy: Paul Newman, Goldie Hawn, Jane Fonda. Seeing a very different side of those people talking about what motivates them to make the world a better place. And you get an opportunity to see them beyond what you would see on screen. Well, I was born and grew up in Midland, Michigan. And when I was young, I got active in the youth fellowship at the church. And so that was probably my first experience with greater good, community good kind of work.
What was your congregation?
Presbyterian. And, that was in the 60s. And there was so much focus on the outside world and how can we make communities better. And I had an opportunity 2 summers in a row while I was in high school to go to a statewide Presbyterian Youth Leadership Conference. And so similar to, what CMF did at Spring Hill, I had a chance to spend a week with young people, high school students from all over the state. And I began to understand that my hometown of Midland isn't like the whole world, and that there are lots of other places where people live and lots of other perspectives that they bring. And so I think that was the start of that kind of view of how broad and rich and diverse the world is. And then I had a chance in college. I went to Alma College, a small liberal arts college. I had a chance to be a resident advisor and work with the students that lived first on my floor and then in my senior year in the whole dorm that I was responsible for. And I had always thought I was going to go to law school after graduating from college, but I so enjoyed that residence hall work that I decided to go on and get a degree in counseling with a focus on higher education counseling. And so I did student affairs work first at Alma College and then at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And then I had a chance to meet Miriam Noland, who was starting the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. And she offered me the opportunity to go and look at working with a much broader community than I'd been doing at CCS. And at CCS, which is in inner city Detroit, I not only worked with the students on campus, but also got involved with community groups in that neighborhood who were working at developing affordable housing, working with the Coleman Young administration, and I wound up being appointed to the Citizens District Council by Mayor Young, so I could have a formal role working with these groups. And so, it feels like for much of my life, I've been working with groups thinking about how can we make our neighborhood, our community, our region, the country a better place to live. And to be able to do that from a philanthropic seat is a very honored position. And every day we think about our founders, Tracy and Catherine McGregor, and the philanthropic work that they were doing in Detroit. And we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, how would Tracy and Catherine have felt about this? What sort of a funding decision would they have made? And we have those discussions with our board of trustees as well. We remain very cognizant of what the founders were interested in.
Were your parents activists?
My dad was an educator, and my mom was a community volunteer. She did lots of volunteer work with the church, with the hospital, and those kinds of things.
She dragged you around with her?
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah.
That's good. And brothers and sisters?
One brother, one sister. Neither of them as involved in these kinds of things as I am, but my sister and brother-in-law are very involved in their community in Ohio with natural resources work. They've done a lot to promote a large, probably 15, 20 acre park, natural area outside of town, develop programs for it and things like that.
And you have one daughter?
Yes.
Yes, and have you tried to, bring her along in this field or in her thinking?
Yes.
And how have you done that?
I think it's partly been through example, talking about the things that we're interested in. We talk with her a lot about the organizations that Susan and I are involved with, the organizations that we're supporting ourselves personally, financially, and she has become quite an activist herself. She was in India doing work earlier this year in a very small rural village, and she has decided to make this the subject of her doctoral dissertation. She's in the second year of her PhD program, and she is so interested in how people live in this community. The national government is trying to move poor people out of the way so it can be developed for tourist uses. And Morgan is working with the local population to find ways that they can connect with the tourism economy that's going to be coming to this region that's now a World Heritage Site. So we're proud of her.